The silence an avoidant maintains is not comfortable. That is the first thing worth establishing, because the silence looks comfortable from the outside. It looks like someone who made a decision and settled into it, like a person who created distance and found in the distance the regulated equilibrium they were always moving toward. The silence looks chosen, looks sustainable, looks like the natural resting state of someone for whom space was always the preference and whose preference has now simply been honored. It isn't comfortable. It is the daily, effortful maintenance of a position that the avoidant's own interior keeps working against. The silence requires upkeep. It requires the ongoing deployment of the suppression strategies, the continued investment of psychological energy into keeping the wanting below the threshold of action, the persistent redirection of the attentional drift that keeps orienting toward the possibility of contact. The silence is not rest, it is labor, constant, largely invisible, increasingly costly labor that the avoidant performs against their own genuine feeling every single day that the silence holds. What breaks the silence? What finally forces the internal pressure past the architecture's capacity to contain it is not a single thing. It is the convergence of multiple forces, each insufficient alone, that together produce a threshold moment where the cost of maintaining the silence exceeds the cost of breaking it. Understanding what those forces are and how they build toward convergence is what this is about, not as a manual for manufacturing the convergence artificially, but as an honest account of the psychology of what actually moves inside the avoidant when the silence finally gives. The first force is the accumulation of undelivered experience. Throughout the duration of the silence, the avoidance life continues producing things, moments, observations, thoughts, encounters with beauty or difficulty or humor or strangeness that generate, in the immediate instant of their occurrence, the impulse toward sharing, not generically. Specifically, the impulse to share with you, to send the thing, the thought, the observation in your direction, because you are the person whose reception of it the avoidance mind reaches for automatically, because you are the person who would understand it in the specific way it wants to be understood, or respond to it in the way that would complete the experience of having noticed it, or receive it with the quality of genuine engagement that makes sharing feel like the natural completion of the noticing. The avoidant doesn't send these things. The silence is being maintained. The impulse arises, and the architecture intercepts it, and it doesn't become action. But it doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Each undelivered thing adds to a growing internal collection of shared experience that was never shared, of moments that were had alone, that were meant, at the level of the avoidant's genuine orientation, to be had with you. The collection builds, and as it builds, it produces its own form of pressure, the pressure of a life that keeps generating the evidence of your continued relevance to the avoidance experience of it, the pressure of the gap between the life being lived and the person with whom the living of it keeps wanting to be shared. This pressure is not something the management can fully neutralize. The management can intercept individual impulses. It cannot prevent the accumulation of the undelivered things or the growing internal evidence of their meaning. And at some point the collection becomes large enough and specific enough and impossible to ignore enough that the architecture's capacity to keep it from producing action begins to fail. The second force is what happens to the avoidant self-narrative under the sustained weight of the silence. The silence was constructed with a story around it, a story that made the silence feel like the right and reasonable and perhaps even mature response to the situation, a story that had enough internal coherence to function in the early stages of the silence when the management was at full capacity and the grief and the wanting and the undelivered things were still being adequately suppressed. The story erodes, not all at once, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the cumulative effect of the experience of the silence not feeling the way the story said it would feel. The story said the distance would produce relief. The relief didn't fully come. The story said the space would feel like freedom. The space feels like absence. The story said time would reduce the significance of what was lost to something manageable. Time is increasing the evidence of the significance rather than reducing it. Each discrepancy between what the story predicted and what the experience delivers is a small fracture in the narrative's authority, and the authority of the narrative is what the silence depends on for its continued maintenance. The silence was justified by the story. The story is failing, and a silence without adequate justification is a silence that is increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of the internal pressure that has been building from every other direction. The third force is the activation of what attachment researchers call the proximity-seeking system, the neurological drive toward contact with the attachment figure that activates when the attachment feels genuinely threatened. During the period when the avoidant maintained the silence while you were still oriented toward them, still present in some form, still invested, still representing available connection, this system was quiet. There was no threat to the attachment. The avoidant could maintain the distance because you were still there, still available, still ensuring that the attachment was accessible even if the avoidant wasn't actively engaging with it. Your genuine departure, your actual movement away from the orientation toward them, your real investment of attention and energy into your own life independent of the question of them, changes the attachment system's assessment. The threat is now real rather than theoretical. The attachment is genuinely at risk of permanent loss rather than temporarily paused. And the proximity-seeking system, designed specifically to activate under conditions of genuine attachment threat, begins generating the drive toward contact that is its primary function. This drive is experienced by the avoidant not as a clear labeled desire for contact, but as an undifferentiated urgency, a restlessness that doesn't fully resolve, a persistent background activation that the normal management tools don't adequately quiet, an ambient pressure that keeps orienting toward you without always completing the orientation into conscious acknowledgement of what it is about. The proximity-seeking system is doing its job, which is to ensure that the attachment figure is not permanently lost, and it is doing it with the patient, persistent, neurologically grounded authority that it has always had, regardless of what the avoidance conscious management prefers to be happening. The fourth force is the failure of substitution, which has been discussed in other contexts, but deserves specific attention here in the context of what breaks the silence, because the substitution failure has a specific implication for the silence that it doesn't have for other aspects of the dynamic. The silence was implicitly premised on the substitutability of what was lost. If the connection with you was one of a type, if what you provided was the kind of thing that could be adequately met by other connections, then the silence made a certain practical sense. The need that the connection was serving could be redirected toward other available sources. The loss would be absorbed by the alternatives, and the silence could be maintained without fundamental cost to the avoidance overall quality of relational experience. The substitution failure dismantles this premise. Each interaction with each new person that doesn't reach what interactions with you reached is another piece of evidence that the silence is being maintained at a cost that the substitution is not offsetting. The need is not being met elsewhere. The gap the silence created is not being filled by the available alternatives. The silence is, in the plain and unavoidable arithmetic of the evidence, costing the avoidance something that nothing else is currently providing. When this arithmetic becomes undeniable, when the evidence of the substitution failure has accumulated to the point where the premise of the silence can no longer be sustained, the silence loses its last practical justification. It is no longer the reasonable management of a loss that can be adequately absorbed. It is the ongoing, expensive, increasingly hard to justify maintenance of a distance that is producing real costs without real compensating benefits. The fifth force is the specific, personal confrontation with regret that arrives when the avoidance honest accounting reaches sufficient depth, not the background regret that sits in the ambient quality of their daily experience. The specific you-oriented authorship acknowledging regret that arrives when the management fails to sustain the externalized story of why things ended, and the internal source becomes unavoidable. Regret of this specificity and this depth has a particular motivational quality that other painful emotions don't always produce. Grief, without the authorship acknowledgement, can be experienced as something that happened to the avoidant, as a loss sustained rather than a loss produced. That framing, however inaccurate, is compatible with the silence. If the loss was something that happened, the silence is a response to circumstances. If the loss was something that was produced, authored, through the architecture's operation, through the accumulated choices of the deactivating process, then the silence is complicity in the continuation of something that the avoidant's own psychology created. The regret makes the silence complicit in a way that the management finds increasingly difficult to make peace with. Each day of the silence, after the regret has reached its authorship acknowledging depth, is another day of choosing the continuation of something that the avoidant's own honest assessment says was a mistake. And the accumulation of those days, each one a small additional weight on the side of breaking the silence rather than maintaining it, eventually produces its own convergence with all the other forces that have been building. What the convergence feels like from the inside is not dramatic. It does not feel like a moment of decision. It does not feel like the architecture suddenly giving way in a single collapse. It feels more like the ordinary morning that simply doesn't have enough suppression left in it to get through the first half hour without the wanting producing action before the management has fully engaged. Or the ordinary evening where the accumulation of undelivered things reaches a specific critical mass that converts the impulse into a message before the architecture can intercept the conversion. Or the specific, particular, unforeseeable moment when something external, a song, a date, a quality of light, connects with the internal pressure at exactly the point where the remaining architecture is thinnest, and the connection produces the action before the system has time to prevent it. The reaching out, when it comes from genuine convergence rather than from strategy, has a specific quality that distinguishes it from every previous form of avoidant communication. It has the quality of something that was held too long and finally released, not with the polished, managed, deliberately constructed quality of communication that the avoidance system normally produces, where every word is processed through the management before it reaches expression, where the vulnerability is rationed to maintain deniability, where the message is engineered to convey just enough without requiring the sender to be accountable for having conveyed it. The message that comes from genuine convergence is rawer than that, smaller often than the feeling that produced it, because the architecture is still present and still filtering, and the gap between the feeling and the expression remains even when the feeling has finally produced expression, but with a quality of genuine interior origin that is perceptible beneath whatever surface the message presents. The timing is often a way that suggests genuine rather than calculated motivation. The wording has a specificity that couldn't have been manufactured. It references something true, something that required genuine memory of what was real between you, rather than the management's flattened version of it. Or it is conspicuously simple, in a way that suggests someone who tried to say more and couldn't find the way, rather than someone who said exactly what they intended. What you do with the reaching, when it arrives, has already been addressed in other contexts. But what deserves specific attention here is what the reaching itself communicates about the architecture's current state. Because the reaching is not just a message, it is evidence of the specific convergence that produced it, of the accumulated undelivered things, and the eroded narrative, and the activated proximity-seeking system, and the failed substitution, and the authorship acknowledging regret, all reaching a simultaneous threshold that the silence couldn't survive. That convergence is not easily reversed. The architecture that failed to prevent the reaching will reassert itself after the reaching. The management will engage and attempt to rebuild the containment and produce the familiar oscillation of the approach, followed by the management-generated retreat. But the architecture that reasserts after a genuine convergence breaking is not the same architecture that existed before the convergence. Something has shifted, not fully, not stably, not in a way that guarantees different behavior going forward, but in the specific way that any system that has failed once is different from a system that has never failed. It knows now that the failure is possible, The threshold has been demonstrated to exist, and demonstrated thresholds are lower the next time. The most important thing to understand about what forces the breaking of the silence is also the most counterintuitive thing about the entire dynamic. The force that is most reliably associated with the silence finally giving is not any external intervention, not the right message sent at the right time, not the strategic deployment of no contact, not the perfectly calibrated behavior designed to activate the protest response. These things can contribute to the environment in which the convergence occurs. They do not produce the convergence themselves. The convergence is produced by the avoidant's own interior, by the specific combination of genuine feeling and sufficient accumulation, and failed management, an eroded narrative, an activated attachment system all reaching their respective thresholds at the same time. The forcing of the silence is not done to the avoidant from outside. It is done by the avoidant's own psychology, by the genuine, persistent, ultimately stronger than the architecture reality of what they feel and what they have lost, and what the maintaining of the silence is costing them in terms they can no longer manage to an acceptable level. What you contribute to this, what your genuine development and your genuine self-possession and your genuine movement into your own life provides, is the specific external conditions that interact with the avoidance internal convergence most productively. Your genuine equanimity doesn't produce the convergence, but it creates an environment in which the convergence, when it reaches its internal threshold, is most likely to produce action rather than another round of suppression. Because the thing that most reliably prevents a genuine convergence from producing action is the anticipation of a response that would require more than the current architecture can handle. The fear of producing a response that reactivates the threat level and requires the management to work harder than the convergence has reduced it to being able to work. Your genuine equanimity removes that fear, or reduces it sufficiently. The avoidant who anticipates reaching out to someone whose response will be grounded and genuine and non-desperate, whose response will be warm but not overwhelming, open but not immediately organized around an outcome that requires sustained vulnerability the architecture can't yet sustain, is an avoidant whose convergence is more likely to complete into action, because the anticipated cost of the action is within the range that the convergence has temporarily made manageable. This is the specific, practical, psychologically grounded reality of what your genuine development contributes to the possibility of the silence breaking, not the strategy of appearing equanimous to produce the approach. The genuine equanimity that makes the approach feel survivable to a system that is assessing, constantly and with extraordinary sensitivity, whether the vulnerability of breaking the silence will produce something the remaining architecture can manage. Your genuine development, the real, internally sourced, not performed for effect quality of your own groundedness and self-possession, is the environmental condition most conducive to the avoidance internal convergence, completing into external action. Not because it manipulates the avoidant, because it accurately represents the reality of the interaction that breaking the silence would produce, a reality that is genuinely less threatening than the architecture's default threat assessment, a reality that the avoidance system, encountering the accurate representation of it, can register as within the range of survivable vulnerability. The silence breaks when the internal pressure exceeds the architecture's containment capacity. Your genuine groundedness is what creates the external conditions in which the breaking is most likely to produce something real, rather than another iteration of the managed, deniable approach, that is, also a retreat that the architecture produces when it is still sufficiently operational to filter the expression of the convergence into something the avoidant doesn't have to be fully accountable for. The genuine reaching, unfiltered, accountable, carrying the actual weight of what the convergence produced, is what becomes possible when the internal pressure is sufficient and the external environment is genuinely safe. You cannot produce the internal pressure. That is the avoidance to generate through the specific, layered, time-requiring process that the full weight of genuine loss produces in a psychology that was constructed to be impervious to exactly this kind of feeling. But the genuine safety, The real, embodied, non-manufactured quality of a person who is genuinely okay and genuinely open without being genuinely desperate, that is yours to offer, not as a strategy, as the authentic expression of who you have genuinely become through the full arc of your own development, as the natural result of having done your own work, grieved your own grief, built your own life, developed your own clarity. That person, the one you have actually become, is the environment in which the avoidance silence is most likely to finally, genuinely, accountably give. Not because you forced it, because you became someone whose presence, even in the imagination of the avoidant who is sitting in the silence working up to breaking it, feels like the specific thing the convergence was always moving toward. Safe enough to reach, real enough to reach toward, worth the breaking of every silence that was ever built to protect against exactly this. Safe enough to reach. Those three words carry more psychological weight than their simplicity suggests, because the reaching, the actual architecture breaking, silence ending moment of contact requires a specific quality of felt safety that is different from intellectual safety. The avoidant can know, cognitively, that reaching out is unlikely to produce catastrophic consequences, can assess rationally that the person on the other end is not going to respond with cruelty or with the kind of overwhelming emotional demand that the threat response system most fears. Cognitive safety is available relatively early in the process. It doesn't produce the reaching, because the reaching requires something that operates below the cognitive level, the felt, bodily, nervous system registered sense that the vulnerability of breaking the silence is survivable in the way that the specific physical, precognitive threat assessment says is survivable. That felt safety is different from performed safety on the receiving end and different from assessed safety on the sending end. It is the specific quality of what the avoidance nervous system registers when it imagines, and it does imagine, repeatedly, in the approach and retreat cycles that precede the actual breaking, what the contact would produce, not what the mind concludes it would produce, what the body anticipates, the specific somatic response to the imagined scenario of contact, whether the imagining produces a contraction or an opening, whether the anticipated response generates more activation or less, whether the scenario of reaching feels, at the level where feelings actually live, like moving towards something or like moving into something. The avoidant has been running this imagining regularly throughout the silence. It is part of what the approach and retreat cycles consist of, the repeated mental rehearsal of the reaching, the assessment of the imagined response, the decision about whether the anticipated outcome is within the range that the current architecture can manage. Each rehearsal that produces too much activation sends the approach back into retreat. Each rehearsal that finds the anticipated response genuinely manageable moves the threshold slightly closer to the action. Your genuine development affects this imagining directly, not because the avoidant has current information about your specific internal state. They may not, but because the imagining draws on everything the avoidance system has ever registered about you, about the quality of your presence, about how you responded to vulnerability in the past, about the specific texture of your engagement when the dynamic was active, and the specific texture of your departure when it concluded. All of this is encoded in the avoidance nervous system as the database from which the imagining constructs its anticipated scenario. If what is encoded includes the genuine, non-desperate, self-possessed quality of your presence, if the database contains the memory of someone who is warm without being overwhelming, engaged without being organized around needing a specific response, caring without making the caring a form of pressure, then the imagined scenario that the imagining constructs from this database will carry that quality, will feel, in the body's anticipatory response to it, like the specific kind of safety that makes the reaching survivable, like contact with someone who will receive the reaching without immediately converting it into a demand for more than the reaching was, like the specific, rare, nervous system registered quality of genuine non-threat. This is why the authentic version of your development matters more than any performed version could. The database is built from genuine experience. The nervous system reads authenticity at a level that performance cannot replicate, and the imagining that the avoidant runs in the cycles of approach and retreat that precede the breaking is drawing on the authentic database, drawing on what was actually present in the interactions with you, drawing on the genuine quality of your presence rather than on any constructed version of it. If what was genuinely present in you was the hoping organized, managing their comfort quality of someone whose well-being was contingent on their response, then that is what the imagining draws on, and the imagined scenario produces activation rather than opening, and the threshold for breaking the silence remains higher than the convergence pressure can reach. If what was genuinely present was the grounded, self-possessed, warmly available but not desperate quality of someone whose center of gravity was genuinely their own, then the imagining draws on that, and the imagined scenario produces the specific bodily, opening quality that makes the threshold reachable. The imagining doesn't only draw on past experience, it also draws on current evidence, on whatever signals the avoidance system has been able to register about your current state through whatever indirect channels are available. Not surveillance. The avoidant is not monitoring your life with deliberate attention, but the ordinary, ambient, unavoidable registration of information that arrives through shared contexts, mutual connections, the general quality of your presence or absence in the spaces where you both exist. This ambient information is processed by the avoidance system with the same extraordinary sensitivity that it processes everything else related to the attachment, and what it registers about your current quality, whether you seem contracted or expanded, whether you seem organized around them or genuinely oriented toward your own life, whether the quality of your presence suggests ongoing hoping or genuine forward movement, contributes to the anticipatory scenario the imagining constructs. Genuine forward movement on your part, registered through whatever indirect channels are available, is one of the more potent contributors to the convergence reaching its threshold. Not because it activates the protest response in the straightforward way that dramatic departure sometimes does, though it contributes to that too, but because it changes the imagining's database in real time. It updates the anticipated scenario toward the version that the avoidance nervous system finds most approachable, the scenario in which the person on the other end of the reach is genuinely, currently, in their own life, rather than waiting in the reaching's direction. The scenario that promises contact with someone who has their own gravitational center, rather than someone whose gravity is still oriented toward the avoidance response. There is a specific moment in the approach and retreat cycle that immediately precedes the breaking of the silence, a moment that the avoidant experiences differently from all the preceding approach rehearsals. That is worth describing. It is the moment when the imagining stops feeling like imagining and starts feeling like memory of something that hasn't happened yet. When the scenario of reaching out becomes so vivid and so repeatedly rehearsed and so close to the level of felt reality that the distinction between the imagined contact and the actual contact begins to blur. This blurring is the threshold moment, the moment when the nervous system's resistance to the action drops below the level of the convergence pressure, when the anticipated vulnerability of the reaching feels, in the body's assessment, already partially survived, because the imagining has been so complete and so repeated that the body has already processed much of the activation that the actual reaching would produce. The surprise factor that makes vulnerability most threatening, the not knowing how it will feel quality that keeps novel exposures maximally activating, has been reduced by the repetition of the rehearsal. The action is still frightening, but the frightening is at a level the convergence-reduced architecture can now manage. This is when the message gets sent. When the reaching happens, not from a resolved place, not from a place where the fear has been replaced by confidence, from a place where the fear is present and the action happens anyway, in the specific, imperfect, architecture still present way that all genuine avoidant breakthroughs happen. Not clean, not fully expressed, not carrying on the surface the full weight of what the convergence produced, but real. genuinely, importantly, consequentially real. After the message is sent, in the seconds and minutes and hours immediately following the breaking of the silence, the avoidant experiences something that is entirely predictable and entirely uncomfortable and worth understanding if you are the person receiving the message. The architecture reasserts, not fully, not back to the level of containment it had before the convergence broke it, but enough to produce the familiar quality of having reached and then wanting, immediately, to manage what the reaching revealed. This post-reaching management is not the same as the pre-reaching avoidance. It comes from a different place. The pre-reaching avoidance was the architecture successfully preventing action. The post-reaching management is the architecture attempting to limit the vulnerability of the action already taken. It produces different behavior, not the pulling back into full silence, in most cases, but the hedging, the introduction of casualness into what was not casual, the management of the stakes of the message downward after the message has been sent, through whatever channels are available, responding to your response in a way that is slightly cooler than the initial reach, introducing the ambiguity that reestablishes some deniability about what the reach actually meant. This post-reaching management is one of the most common places where the possibility opened by the silence breaking gets unnecessarily closed. Because from your position, receiving the initial reach and then receiving the management of the reach, the most natural interpretation is that the initial reach was less significant than it seemed, that the casualness of the follow-up is the truth, and the urgency of the initial contact was an anomaly rather than the other way around. This interpretation is wrong. The initial reach was the truth, and the follow-up management is the architecture's response to the truth. But it is understandable, and acting from it in ways that communicate disappointment or withdrawal can confirm the architecture's reasserted threat assessment and produce the full retreat that converts the broken silence back into a silence, more defended than the one it interrupted. What serves the opening that the breaking created is the same quality that was described as conducive to the breaking in the first place. The grounded, non-anxious, genuinely equanimous reception of the full cycle, the initial reach and the subsequent management, without either idealizing the reach or being deflated by the management. The response that meets what is actually present, which is a person whose genuine feeling broke through the silence and whose architecture is now attempting to manage the exposure of that breaking with the warm, clear, non-demanding presence that your development has made genuinely available. The breaking of the silence is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of the beginning. The threshold that was crossed is real, and its crossing changed something in the architecture that is not easily reversed. But the territory on the other side of the threshold is not resolved territory. It is the specific, uncertain, requires continued navigation territory of two people, each in their own process, each carrying their own history and their own development and their own version of what the connection meant and what its interruption cost. Finding out whether what the silence was maintaining distance from is something that can now, with the changes each person has undergone, be approached differently. That finding out requires time, requires the accumulation of interactions that each demonstrate, incrementally, whether the architecture is genuinely reorganizing or simply temporarily overridden, requires the honest assessment, on your part, of whether what is being offered in the aftermath of the silence breaking is substantively different from what was offered before the silence, or whether the familiar patterns are reasserting themselves in new clothing. The breaking of the silence is significant. It is the architecture failing to contain the genuine feeling at a level that was previously sufficient. It is the convergence of every force that has been described. The undelivered things, the eroded narrative, the proximity-seeking activation, the failed substitution, the authorship acknowledging regret, reaching the threshold that converts internal pressure into external action. It is real, and it is not trivial, and it is more than many avoidant dynamics ever produce. What it is not is a guarantee, not of change, not of the sustained, behaviorally consistent, architecturally reorganized presence that genuine connection requires, not of the outcome that the breaking might seem to promise. The silence breaking is the first honest thing the avoidant has communicated since the silence began. It is not the last thing that honest communication will require. What comes after it? The patient, grounded, non-anxious, clear-eyed navigation of the territory that the breaking opened is where the real question lives. And the real question is not whether the avoidant reached out. They did. The question is what they do next, whether the reaching was the beginning of a genuine approach or the latest iteration of the approach and retreat cycle at a new level of intensity. Whether the convergence that broke the silence was the product of genuine interior development or the temporary override of an architecture that will rebuild itself once the acute pressure of the convergence has been released. Time answers that question. Behavior across time answers it. Not the behavior of the reaching, which was real, but the behavior of what follows the reaching. The consistency or inconsistency of the showing up. The direction of travel across multiple interactions. The evidence, accumulating or not accumulating, that something in the avoidant has genuinely reorganized rather than temporarily exceeded its own containment. You will know, not from what they say in the reaching, from what they do in the time after it, from the quality of the presence they bring to the interactions that the breaking makes possible, from the honest, grounded, clear-eyed assessment that your genuine development has made available to you, the assessment that knows the difference between someone who is genuinely arriving and someone who is performing arrival while the architecture rebuilds behind the performance. You will know, and what you know will be the basis of every decision that follows, not hope, not the memory of what the connection was at its best, not the weight of what the reaching seemed to promise. What is actually present? What is actually being offered? What is actually, in the plain and honest accounting of behavior across time, different? That clarity is yours, earned through everything described across the full arc of this examination. And it is the most valuable thing you carry into whatever the breaking of the silence opens toward. More valuable than the breaking itself. More reliable than the feeling the breaking produced in you. More worth trusting than any single moment of genuine approach. Because it is not a moment. It is the accumulated, hard-won, experientially grounded wisdom of someone who has been through the full arc of this and emerged knowing what they know. And what you know is enough. It has always been enough. It is, in the complete and honest accounting, exactly what this entire arc was building toward.